Well, all right, everybody. Welcome to the Pastor's Bible Study. How are y'all today? How'd Katie do last week? Y'all, what do y'all think? She do a good job? Oh, come on, man. I actually watched it, and I knew when I was going to be gone. I gave her the easiest text in Genesis to cover, and so it's not that big a deal. So she noticed I said that I gave her the easiest text to cover. If you remember last week, you'll know. And anyway, but thank you, Katie, for filling in for me last week. And so today we're going to pick up where Katie left off, Genesis 10. So we're going to start today. And we're going to go through chapter 11, verse 26. And I've entitled it Shame, Scattered, and Shem, one of Noah's sons. So let's look at this text, Genesis 10 and part of Genesis 11. Genesis 10 is the very famous table of nations. And it's a little interesting. I noticed that last week Katie pointed out just the literary beauty of the book of Genesis. And it really does have that. If you're not paying attention, you may not see that, but if you are, there's many times there are plays on words. Sometimes there are connecting words that are used in different narratives to make sure that you connect these stories together. For example, the Hebrew word Peleg, we'll see that as a name today. It's a little bit of a play on words with the Hebrew word Peleg, which means to be divided. And so there's this story today in Genesis 11 of division, but also the story of the descendants of Peleg. So there are all these nuances and literary devices that are used by the writer to just really weave together a beautiful account of this grand story. We're still in what scholars would refer to as primeval history. What that means is we're still before the age of written history. We're going to have to get to Genesis 12 before we will have corroborating written material historically. So we're still in ancient past. So you end chapter 9, and the flood has subsided, and Noah has now begun to reestablish humanity on the earth along with his family. And we end chapter 9 with his death. And then we open page 10, and now the story is told about what happened to everybody. Now it's interesting. The oldest son is Shem. The youngest is Japheth. Ham's in the middle. The other day, I was talking through this story with Ada, and her take was, who would name their son Ham? She said, what a weird name. So I told her I had no explanation for that. But anyway, if you'll look at chapter 10, verse 1, there's the order of their birth. Shem, Ham, Japheth. But the writer decides to tell their history in the opposite order. So he starts with the younger son first, verse 2, with the sons of Japheth. And then he will tell the story of the sons of Ham. And you remember in the story that Katie taught on last week, Ham is the one who receives the curse from Noah. So his story is then told. And then you pick up the story of Shem beginning in verse 21. The reason for that is that this is not a pure genealogy. There are some places in our Bibles where we have pure genealogies. This is a theological account, and so what the writer is doing is he's addressing the forgotten lines first, and then the line of promise comes last. We've already seen him do that with the line of Cain and then the line of Seth. He's going to do that later with the line of Isaac and the line of Ishmael. You'll take care of what scholars usually refer to as the forgotten line. In other words, that's the line that's not going to be factored in ultimately in the story of Israel, the children of promise. And then the line of promise will be shared. That's exactly what happens here. However, interspersed in this story of the genealogy of Shem, if you look at verse 21 of chapter 10, he is beginning to tell us about Shem, and then he's going to interrupt this story with another story in chapter 11, which some scholars think takes place before chapter 10. And then if you'll look at verse 12, or verse 10 rather, of chapter 11, he picks back up on Shem's line. So he's going to interrupt the story of Shem and tell us the story of the Tower of Babel. So it's kind of an interesting way to lay all this out in front of us. But if you'll look back at chapter 9, verse 1, the text says, "Then God blessed Noah and his sons." So Noah's family has been blessed by God. And if you look at verse 17 of chapter 9, God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant I have established now between me and all life on the earth." So now we're going to read, if you go back to chapter 10, the story of be fruitful, multiply, and subdue the earth. Noah has received the promise of God's blessing, just like Adam did. Adam's family now has all been destroyed except for Noah's descendants. So now we're back down to one family. It's the family of Noah. And there's a promise of blessing in this text. And basically what's happening is the writer is showing the interconnectedness of all of humanity. And you'll notice if you were to take the time to count all of these, if you were to spend a little time in Genesis 10, you'll discover there are 70 nations. Now that's interesting. Most scholars believe that what's happening is this is not a complete genealogy. This is a representative genealogy because the number 70 is 7 times 10, and that is representative of completeness. And in the telling of this story, basically if we give Moses being credit for being the author, he is basically explaining the reality of the human context before the time of Abraham. So if you're living at that time and you want to know, so where did all these names come from? Why do we have Egypt and Canaan and Moab and all these different nations and peoples that were at least a part of the human experience by the time we get to Abraham? Well, here's the explanation. Here's where they all came from. And they're all interconnected. And if you look at the generations, Japheth had 14 generations. Ham's going to have 30 generations. Shem's going to have 26 generations. Some of the names that are listed in these stories are actual names of people. Some of them are names of nations. It's a personal, socio-political, geographical explanation of the known world prior to the time of Abraham. We have other accounts like this in the ancient world. The Babylonians had an account trying to explain where all these people came from, so it wasn't uncommon for people to reach back in history and try to explain how did we all get here. Some of y'all do that in your own families, don't you? Any of y'all ever done genealogical research in your families? You know, most families have that person, right? Tommy, my brother, is that person in our family. Tommy will sometimes write us. In fact, he wrote us yesterday and said, "Hey, I just found out something about our great-great-great-grandfather, Freeman Wiles. When he died, he had no will." And Tommy found somehow in all his genealogical research the probation of Freeman Wiles' possessions. And he wanted me to know that in his possession, when he died, he was born in 1760. When he died, he had a church history book, The History of Christianity, that he had purchased. And he also had a couple of books of theology. So Tommy wanted me to know I was not the first church historian, theologian in the family. That you can go all the way back to my great-great-great-grandfather Freeman. You research, sometimes our genealogists have a better understanding of where everybody came from. Well, that's what's happening here. We've reached way back into history. Who knows how far back? Here's how Moses puts it. Here's what he said. I'm just going to start in the beginning. So that's how far back we're going to go. However far back that is. And so now he's telling the story and he's compressing some of it. And he's using his understanding of history, what God's revealed to him, what he's discovered. But he writes it with a theological perspective because it's in the Scripture. So even this genealogy is written with theological lens. So you get the story of Japheth first. That line is going to basically be forgotten when it comes to the line of promise. The story of Ham's family, that line is going to be forgotten when it comes to the sons of promise. Then you come to Shem. This is the line of promise. And so this is the one that's going to get the most amount of attention and detail. Now, you do have a random guy that just stands out. Sometimes that happens in genealogies in the Old Testament. We're not always sure why, but just sometimes it does. So, for example, if you look at chapter 10, verse 8, Moses pauses to give you a glimpse into a certain person that he's going to pick up that person's story here in just a minute. That's probably why he did it this time. So if you look at verse 8, he says, Cush was the father of Nimrod. Y'all ever heard of Nimrod? He was a mighty warrior. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That's why it's said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. His kingdom, it says, was centered, notice where? Babylon and Shinar. Okay? And so we believe he singles him out because evidently his people primarily become the focus of the story that's going to be told on page 11. Okay? So you get to the end of chapter 10, verse 32. These are the clans of Noah's sons, according to their lines of descent, within their nations, and from these the nations spread out over the earth after the flood. And it's interesting that he uses the Hebrew word for nations, not the Hebrew word for peoples. Typically in the Old Testament, when the people of God are referred to, the Hebrew word for people is used, not the Hebrew word for nation. This time the Hebrew word for nation is used. So it's the understanding that God is describing that, or the writer is describing that God is the God of all nations, not just the people of Israel. Okay? So with that said, kind of with that setting, that backdrop, where you've got this explanation of the known world, then you come to the Tower of Babel. Very fascinating story in our Bibles, very famous story. Chapter 11, let's look at it, verse 1. Now remember how Hebrew sometimes, the words in Hebrew, it's a limited language. Words can have numerous meanings. You have to sometimes contextualize them to understand. Here's a good example of that. Chapter 11, verse 1 says, Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. Okay, let's think about that for a second. The word world is also the word for land. And so it could mean that just this land that I'm aware of, I would call it the land that's known, if you will. At this point in time, they shared a language and a speech. It's kind of fascinating because look back at chapter 10, verse 5. It says, From these, the maritime people spread out into their territories by their clans within their nations, each with its own language. So chapter 10, you've got a reference to multiple languages. Chapter 11, you got one language. Well, there are several explanations for that, probably. One of them would be that chapter 11, the Tower of Babel, is describing something that happened before chapter 10 is actually explaining all these nations. The other one is, the other explanation, which a lot of scholars really lean into, is just that it's common in certain parts of the world for people to have a trade language that basically everybody can speak, but it's not their heart language. You know, when we first started working in West Africa, the first place I went in Africa was Morocco. The first place Cindy went was Mali. Mali is a huge nation in West Africa. There's numerous tribes that make up Mali. They all have their own heart language, but they all speak Bambara. Bambara is their trade language, it's not their heart language. So if you were to say the people of Mali all have one language, that would not quite be accurate because they all have their own language, but you could say it because it's accurate in the sense that they share a trade language. Does that make sense? So there was something these people all shared in common. Evidently, if you believe that chapter 11 occurs before chapter 10, it's just basically one language, one speech. Point being, the more challenging thing is, though, is they had one desire. That's what is at the heart of this story. So how do you describe Genesis 11? Well, I've given you some words to consider. Their pride, their desire for urbanization. I'm going to contend idolatry. And then eventually they're going to receive judgment. So let's just look at the story. Chapter 11, it says, so the whole world had one language, a common speech. As people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar. Now remember, Nimrod is credited for being a mighty warrior in that part of the world. Shinar has typically been associated with Sumer, which eventually is going to be known as Babylon. And so Nimrod is associated with that part of the world. So at least his descendants and others with him were moving in this direction. Verse 3, they said to each other, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. The reason for that is, as you move eastward in the Holy Land, you run out of stone. And so these folks are going to have to use different materials than what they typically built with. The temples who were built west of them were built with stone in the ancient world. As you start moving toward Babylon, they will build them with bricks and mortar. We have archaeological evidence of that to this day. Then here's their desire. They said, come, let us build ourselves a city. There's the urbanization, with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Well, there's the pride. Otherwise, we'll be scattered over the face of the whole earth, even though God had told them to multiply and basically subdue the whole earth. There was a fear among at least a whole section of them that they would remain together. Verse 5, but the Lord came down. I love how Moses puts this. The Lord came down to see a city and the tower the people were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language they've begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down. Now there's that plural we. Who would he be referring to? Us. There are hints there for us theologically. But let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other. So the Lord scattered them from there all over the earth. They stopped building the city. That's why it was called Babel. And before there, the Lord confused the language. Because there, the Lord confused the language of the whole world. And from there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. So now at this point, they've received judgment. Well, what was their sin? Was their sin pride? It's part of it. Was their sin urbanization? Some people say that. You think at this point in history, cities are brand new. Cain usually is credited with building the first city. But I don't know that it would be accurate to say it was sinful to build a city, because eventually the people of God are going to build cities. The desire for urbanization was an ancient impulse that was a new development, and it was basically the decision to live collectively and share resources and space with one another. At the heart of it, though, is this idea that we're going to make a name for ourselves. But I would also contend that I believe that pride is at the heart of the brokenness and the sinfulness of these people. But then I would include idolatry, because when you look at what was done in Babylon in particular, a tower, when towers were built, they were known as ziggurats, if you're familiar with them. These ancient structures, they look kind of like pyramids somewhat, but they're a series of steps with a wide base at the bottom, a small base at the top. They were different from pyramids. Pyramids obviously were built primarily in Egypt. Pyramids were hollow. They had spaces inside of them. Ziggurats were not. They were complete structures. There were no doors in the side of ziggurats. But we have ancient writings that depict these towers as reaching into the heavens. And at the very top of the tower, there was a table. There was a place set, if you will, for the gods, for them to come and commune with the people. Those stairs were there for the people. It allowed them to kind of ascend into the heavens, so to speak. Didn't mean that they built a tower so far that it extended all the way into heaven. It was just from their perspective, that's how far it reached. The fascinating thing, y'all, when you study the history of idolatry, it is an interesting journey. Do you know that idolatry, from an historical perspective, is associated with urbanization? It's a study in sociology, psychology, as well as idolatry. It's fascinating that for some reason in the ancient world, when people decided to live together, for whatever reason, at some point in that journey, they began to humanize their gods. It's a fascinating development, sociologically and historically. And that's evidenced by what happened among the Babylonians in particular. They built these ziggurats. They weren't temples. They typically built a temple next to them. And so the urbanization that took place at that time was not that the people all actually lived together in the city. They built a city center that was primarily dedicated to their gods, and the people lived all around them. So the urban area was really, or the downtown, if you want to call it that, was actually some type of a complex that included a building, a temple, a ziggurat, which was the meeting place, if you will, with the gods, and any other administrative buildings that they felt like they needed to extend and bless the urbanization of the people. But the people didn't live in that city. The people lived outside of it. Okay, that was typically the way this all developed. So what seems to be described in chapter 11 is that it was building of a complex, and the result of it was an expression of early idolatry. And so God comes down to visit, which I love that. So one theologian puts it like this: these tiny people built a tiny tower, and an awesome God showed up. And that is really what happens. And I want you to notice that sometimes we read this and we get a little confused by it. If you'll look at verse 6, it says, the Lord said, if one people speaking the same language begun to do this, nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. That doesn't mean that he's scared and they're going to become his rival. What he's basically saying is, you put enough of these people together and they have enough in common, and there's no telling what kind of evil they'll come up with. That's what he's really saying. You give them enough time and enough energy and let them all have enough in common here, nothing will be impossible. In other words, they'll attempt to do just about anything you can imagine or not even imagine. The sin can be so pervasive, in other words. Derek Kidner, he's written this little commentary on Genesis. My favorite little commentaries on Genesis. I've had it for many, many years. He's gone on to be with the Lord now, but I love how he's concise in his explanation of things. Here's what he says about the Tower of Babel. He says, the elements of this story are timelessly characteristic of the spirit of the world. The project is typically grandiose. Men describe it excitedly to one another as if it were the ultimate achievement, very much as modern man glories in his space projects. At the same time, they betray their insecurity as they crowd together to preserve their identity and control their fortunes. I love that depiction. He says this Tower of Babel experience has been lived out over and over and over and over again throughout history, where human beings laud in their own achievements, and then they somewhat panic and they decide somehow they want to control their own fortune and protect their own name. And that is the story that's told here. It's a fascinating story. But the point is, when God sees what they're doing, they've crossed the line. The idolatry, the expression, if you will, of their own control of their own lives. It's almost like an evil protest. God is not responding as a rival. He's responding as the creator of the world and as the father of these people. And so his decision is to judge them. They're trying to somehow, in their own terms, humanize their gods. That was very common in that part of the world. That's what's going to emerge out of urbanization. Sin is going to prevail unless God does something. So God scatters them and he confuses them. Again, Derek Kidner says, better division than collective apostasy. So it's the judgment of God that falls upon them. Fascinating story, and it will be one that's going to be woven into the theological imagination of the Jews. Now, on the heels of that, he goes back now and picks up on the story of Shem. So you've kind of finished this story, if you will, in the Tower of Babel, and the Lord scatters people across the face of the whole earth. Then look at verse 10. He goes back to Shem, and he begins to describe exactly what happened to the descendants of Shem. So when you see that name, I just wanted to connect all these names for you because they're names that are going to be used throughout the Old Testament literature and even to this day. Sometimes people in that part of the world are referred to as Semitic people, as Semites. Well, where does that come from? Well, it comes from Shem, when Shem will be translated into Latin and Greek as well. It's hard to mimic. The pronunciation of Hebrew is hard to mimic in another language. It just is. It's guttural. It's and so many of the other languages gave up on trying to do that, so they just gave their own expression to it. So Shem becomes Sem in Latin. And so the Semitic people is a reference back to this name. And then also the name Eber, which is mentioned in the if you go back to chapter 10, verse 21. Shem was the ancestor of all the sons of Eber. The word Eber means to cross over. And again, when you begin to Latinize that word, it takes on the letter H in Latin to capture the Hebrew pronunciation. And so eventually, these people will be known as Hebrews. That's where that word comes from, we believe. The people who crossed over, they're going to cross over to come into the promised land. They'll also be known as Israel, and of course that name is going to come from the name that God reassigns to Jacob, one who contends with God. Sometimes, many, many years later, they're going to be called the Jews, and the reason for that is because when you get to the division of the northern and southern kingdoms, you have these tribes in the north and you have the tribes in the south, and the two tribes in the south were Judah and Benjamin. You had a smattering of Levites in those two tribes, but Judah was the prominent tribe. It was the tribe of promise. And so people began to refer to Israel as the Jews. In other words, they're descendants of Judah, if you will, even though there are many Jews who are descendants of Benjamin, but Judah was the more prominent tribe. So all those words that we use today to refer to these people can all be traced back to these ancient stories. Then you come to the end of this account and everything is about to change. We're about to go from this massive story trying to explain all of reality that begins in the beginning and somehow gives some level of an explanation of all these peoples who live in the world, all these different nations and all their different languages and everything that seems to be happening around them. And then the story of the Old Testament is going to now funnel down to one person and his family, and that's going to be Abraham. And he's introduced in this story, chapter 11, verse 26. After Terah had lived 70 years, he had 3 kids, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. We're not sure if that's the order in which they were born, because we've already got some evidence in this account that the kids aren't always listed in the order of their birth. We're not really sure. There's some question about that. But the point is, if you look at chapter 11, we're going to talk about this next week because we're going to begin the story with Abraham next week. If you look at verse 32, Terah moved his family to Haran, lived 205 years, and then he died. One of the questions is, so how old was Abraham when he died? How long did Abraham live in that particular part of the world before he ended up being called by God to move? Well, if you look at chapter 12, the text will tell us in chapter 12, verse 4, he was 75 years old when he left Haran. Okay? All right, so let me do a little New Testament stuff, and then we'll kind of put all this together, okay? This stories like this, obviously it's in the psyche of the folks in the New Testament era, because I was talking to the staff yesterday. You know, when you think about the Jews, when the Jews educated their children in the ancient world, they did not have Harry Potter and Brothers Grimm and Jack and Jill and Snow White. All they had were these stories. So they told these stories. And so when a child is growing up in a Hebrew home, that child is going to hear the stories of all of these people that we read about in the Old Testament. So they're going to hear about them, and they're just going to be in their minds. So it shouldn't surprise us when we read our New Testament and Jesus comes, that those early disciples, also including Jesus, somehow use these stories in their explanation of what's actually happening in their time. So that's just the way it is. You know, you and I use common phrases that make sense to us because those phrases are connected to stories that we all know and share. And so when we make those statements, they make sense to us because they're connected to stories that we all know, okay? That was same was true for the New Testament believers who originally were primarily all Jewish, okay? So, for example, in the New Testament, you get to Luke 14, and Jesus says, who builds a tower without considering the cost first? Now, every Jew that would hear the phrase, who's going to build a tower, what's the first tower they're going to think of? When they were kids and their mom was teaching them at home, they've all heard the story of the Tower of Babel. So Jesus doesn't mention the Tower of Babel. He has a whole different point in what he's making, the point that he's making. But there's no question those kinds of stories are in the psyche of the Jews. Acts chapter 7, verse 4 is a little bit more dicey because Stephen says Abraham doesn't leave Haran until his daddy died. Stephen's preaching a sermon. Well, the question is, well, if you go back and read Hebrews 10 and 11, how old was Abraham when his daddy died? Excuse me, some of that depends on how you read this text. We'll read in chapter 12, he was 75 years old. So that's caused scholars have to do a little homework to try to get all these numbers to add up, okay? However, more than likely, Stephen was reading the Septuagint and not the Hebrew Old Testament. As a matter of fact, there are some scholars who believe that Stephen actually was reading the Samaritan Pentateuch rather than the Hebrew Pentateuch, because that was also very popular in the ancient world. It sometimes accounts for some of these discrepancies. But remember how many generations there were in the Table of Nations? How many were there? 70. Luke 10, verse 1, Jesus sends out 70. Okay? Exodus 1, Jacob has 70 descendants. Exodus 24, verse 1, there are 70 elders in Israel. In Luke 10, Jesus sent out 70. Interestingly enough, the Septuagint, when you read the Septuagint, it phrases these generations a little differently in Genesis 10 and 11, and you have 72 generations in the Septuagint. And so there are actually some translations, some Greek manuscripts in Luke 10 that have Jesus sending out 72 rather than 70. The inference is that's a connection to the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament. There were 70 members of the Sanhedrin. The Greek version of the Bible is called the Septuagint, LXX, the number 70. So it's not accidental to me how many generations are mentioned in Genesis 10. That's why I think it's more of a representative theological statement. It's the statement of completion, if you will. And then you can't tell the story as a Christian of the Tower of Babel without telling the story of Pentecost. Because Acts chapter 2, in some ways, is the reversal, if you will, of Pentecost. Remember, all these people were in Israel. They come to Jerusalem for the feast. They were there from all over the world. They all spoke different languages. And when the disciples got up and they began to give testimony as to what was taking place, what does the Bible say? They were confused. They couldn't understand why this was taking place because everybody there understood what they were saying. And they said, how is it that these people are speaking in languages in which they're not trained and we're understanding everything that they're saying? Most New Testament theologians see that as the signal that the Tower of Babel is now being reversed and God is going to take this message to all the nations and the gospel will be proclaimed to all the nations before the return of Jesus. So even the story of Pentecost, in my opinion, is connected to the story of the Tower of Babel. Now, it's a fascinating story. Some people say, well, was this a real story? Did they really build a real tower, or is this more allegorical? You know, I usually don't spend a whole lot of time messing with those kind of conversations because I tend to just read the text. I actually believe this happened. I believe it's a real tower. I believe it was a ziggurat that tended to be common in the urbanization of ancient people. We found 30 of them in the Babylon area in Iraq. They're ancient towers. So there's no doubt this was a common thing that ancient people did in the urbanization of humanity, and they're all associated with idolatry. And the idolatry typically is represented by the humanizing of gods, reducing gods down to human terms. So when you ask the core sin of Babel, I would say it was pride, for sure. But I would also add idolatry, and I believe that's why the judgment of God was so severe. But I turn to the New Testament, and I believe that Pentecost is the reversal of the Tower of Babel. And we have the opportunity now to take the gospel to the whole world and share it with every language and every people. So then you get to the book of Revelation. In chapter 7, John sees this image where there are people from every tribe and every language who are there standing before the Lamb, representing every people group that's heard this gospel and has responded to it and has received the life that it gives. So God is the God of all the nations. In Genesis 10, He's the God of all the nations. In Acts 2, He's the God of all the nations. In Revelation 7. Praise His name. All right, we'll stop right there. So online, folks, I don't think I even greeted you, so I'm going to greet you right now. Thank you for joining us, and goodbye. We'll see you next week, okay?